So good evening, everybody. My name is Holger Klein, and I'm the Lisa and Bernard Selz Professor of the History of Medieval Art, and I'm also the Interim Director of the Sakıp Sabancı Center for Turkish Studies. It is a great honor and a distinct privilege for me to welcome you all to tonight's inaugural Sakıp Sabancı lecture, an event that will become a defining annual feature of our center's academic activities here on Morningside campus from now on. It is an honor and a pleasure this evening to host Professor Şevket Pamuk, Professor of Economics and Economic History at the Atatürk Institute for Modern Turkish History and the Department of Economics of Boğaziçi University in Istanbul, as our inaugural Sakıp Sabancı lecturer. I'm delighted that my esteemed colleague Rashid Khalidi, the Edward Said Professor of Modern Arab Studies and former chair of the Department of History, has agreed to formally introduce Professor Pamuk tonight and to moderate the discussion after his talk. For all of you who are not familiar with Professor Khalidi and his scholarly work, let me give you a short biographical introduction. Professor Khalidi received his BA from Yale University and his DPhil from the University of Oxford. He is the editor of the Journal of Palestine Studies, was president of the Middle East Studies Association, and served as advisor to the Palestinian delegation to the Madrid and Washington Arab-Israeli peace negotiations from October 1991 until June 1993. Rashid Khalidi is the author of numerous scholarly articles and books, among them Brokers of Deceit, How the US Has Undermined Peace in the Middle East, Sowing Crisis, American Dominance and the Cold War in the Middle East, The Iron Cage, The Story of the Palestinian Struggle for Statehood, Resurrecting Empire, Western Footprints, and America's Perilous Path in the Middle East, and many more. Before I turn the podium over to Professor Khalidi to introduce our inaugural Sakıp Sabancı lecturer, I would like to extend my sincere thanks on behalf of Columbia University to the members of the Sabancı family and acknowledge in particular Dilek and Sevil Sabancı, who are with us here tonight. I would also like to acknowledge the presence of Professor Yusuf Leblebici, who is the president and rector of Sabancı University, Özgür Kibris, who is the dean of Arts and Social Sciences, and Ayşe Kadıoğlu, the former dean of Arts and Social Sciences at Sabancı University. It is thanks to them that we have this wonderful center here in New York at Columbia University. It's one of a kind in North America, and with the inaugural Sakıp Sabancı lecture, we will be able to add a fixed star into the firmament of our academic programs over the coming years and for the foreseeable and hopefully eternal future. It is my great pleasure now to turn the podium over to Professor Rashid Khalidi, who will introduce Professor Pamuk and serve as the moderator of the Q&A that will follow. Thank you very much.
What a wonderful audience. Thank you. Thank you very much for coming. This is an honor for me as well, because I'm a historian of the modern Middle East, and I have followed the work of Şevket Pamuk and other distinguished historians of modern Turkey and of the late Ottoman Empire since I was a graduate student many decades ago. And to me, I knew of Şevket's work from very long ago from many of my colleagues who knew him, who were his colleagues. I didn't know him when we were undergraduates at Yale. He was a little bit after me. But I have followed his work ever since. And for those people for whom the novelist whose name you may have heard is the Pamuk, to me, he's the Pamuk, because he is the historian whose work I have followed for many, many, many years. Let me say a few words about Şevket. As Holger mentioned, he is a professor of economics and economic history in the Atatürk Institute for Modern Turkish History and in the Department of Economics at Boğaziçi University in Istanbul. He graduated from Yale, as I've said, just a little bit after me in 1972. And he then went on to do his master's degree and his doctorate at the University of California in Berkeley, where he obtained a PhD in 1978. He has taught at some of the most prestigious institutions in the United States and in Turkey. He's taught at the University of Ankara. He's taught at the University of Pennsylvania. He's taught at Villanova. He's taught at Princeton. He's taught at METU, Middle East Technical University. He's taught at the University of Michigan. He has taught at Northwestern. This is a man who has adorned the faculties of some of the most important institutions of scholarly learning in this country and in Turkey. And it is because he is probably the preeminent economic historian of the Middle East today. He studied with some of the best. He has worked together with some of the best. He has a book with the late Roger Owen, who I would have said was the dean of economic history in the Middle East. He now is the person to whom all of us have to refer for the economic history of Turkey, the economic history of the Ottoman Empire, the economic history of the Middle East. His books are actually too numerous for me to enumerate. You want to hear him, you do not want to hear me. I will just mention a few of them, the ones that I think are the most important. He has a book on a topic that's nothing to do, in fact, with economic history, but it is, I think, it will be one of his most important books, and it will be published by Cambridge. It's entitled Turkey Between Democracy and Authoritarianism, which is a burning topic. I'm looking forward to seeing this. It's coming out hopefully sometime later this year, if I'm not mistaken. The book that we have for sale in the back after the talk, and which will be the basis of Professor Pamuk's talk, is entitled Uneven Centuries, Economic Development in Turkey Since 1820. I received this book before the lecture, and I had a chance to look at it, and it is a summum. It is a magisterial treatment of its topic. I think it is actually the final word on the question of Turkish economic development in the late Ottoman period and through the Republican period. He's published, as I've said, many, many more. Among the ones that I think are the most important are a book entitled A Monetary History of the Ottoman Empire, also published by Cambridge University Press. Another book that I have taught from and I find enormously useful is A History of the Middle East Economies in the 20th Century, which he did together with Roger Owen. This is a book I have taught repeatedly in modern Middle East history. It is, again, the standard work. Another book that I think is really wonderful of his, The Ottoman Empire and European Capitalism, 1820 to 1913, Trade, Investment, and Production. This is a historian's historian. This is a man who, in my opinion, has become the go-to person in his field. And I think we're extremely honored and lucky to have him as the first lecturer in the Sakıp Sabancı Center series. He kicks it off in the best way possible, bringing to it a distinction, expertise, knowledge that is actually unrivaled. So I myself am looking forward to it. And we will be happy to take questions afterwards, but let me introduce Professor Pamuk, and join me please in welcoming him.
Good evening. Let me make sure we are on the right page. Okay. Thank you very much, Rashid, for this very generous introduction. I would also like to thank the board of the Sakıp Sabancı Center and director Holger Klein for the invitation. The late Sakıp Sabancı was a visionary who devoted so much of his life to social causes, including education and arts. I'm honored to be invited to deliver this lecture today, and I wish the Sakıp Sabancı Center all the best in its future activities. I would like to begin with a few words about the past and the present. I'm an economic historian, as Rashid has mentioned. Most economic historians believe that the past influences the present, that history matters. Most economic historians also believe, and most economic economists would agree, that to understand the present and the future, we need to understand the past and how we got here. Today, I hope to offer you some insights from Turkey's past. And I believe we need these insights not only for its own sake, but also in order to understand Turkey's economy today. I want to begin with this graph. This is GDP per capita for countries around the world in the last 2,000 years. You can see that something very unusual happened in the history of humankind during the last 2 centuries. Per capita incomes began to rise significantly after centuries and millennia of little change. There were ups and downs, but very little long-term change. And you will also note that not only things changed substantially in the last 2 centuries, but this change was very uneven, that much of the inequality we see in the world today between countries and also within countries is the result of the things that happened in the last 2 centuries. So basically what happened was technological change since the Industrial Revolution that is responsible for the rise in incomes and the growth of inequalities between countries. That's the proximate cause of what economists call modern economic growth. But there was a lot of inequality, uneven variation between countries. So what I want to do today is to try to insert the case of Turkey into this picture. Where does Turkey belong in this picture? And hopefully I'll try to offer some explanation. Let me say first a few words about Turkey in the general scheme of things. Where does Turkey belong amongst the developing countries? Well, Turkey is large, a large developing country. Turkey has not experienced any colonial rule, perhaps unlike most other developing countries. And Turkey has no oil, so Turkey has to work hard to earn its living, and I think that's a good thing. And I can add a few more things. When you look at the last 2 centuries, economic policies, economic model in Turkey, in each of the 4 periods I will mention, have been similar to those of most other developing countries. In each of the 4 periods, Turkey pursued economic policies similar to most other developing countries. So I think, and I will argue, that these are strong reasons, good reasons for studying the case of Turkey, not only for its own sake, but also for drawing lessons for other developing countries, which I hope I have to do. What I want to do today is to first show you that Turkey's rate of economic growth, or rates of increase of per capita income during the last 2 centuries, have remained close to, but a little above averages for developing countries as a whole. Close to, but a little above averages for developing countries. And then I will try to build an explanation for this pattern. I will begin with some economic variables, what economists call proximate causes, that will help us understand why there was some growth. I will also argue that economic variables alone cannot explain the extent and the pattern of economic development. So I will, in the last part of my presentation, I'll also talk about some non-economic, social, political causes and how they interacted with the economic. And these I would call the deeper causes. The term uneven in the title of my talk and also in the title of my recent book refers to a number of things. It refers to the fact that these last 2 centuries have been uneven for the world as a whole, but they've been also uneven for Turkey because of the way the gains from economic growth have been distributed inside Turkey between high and low income people, but also between regions of Turkey. And also, economic development in Turkey has been uneven over time during the last 2 centuries. We've experienced some good times, and we've experienced also some bad times. So I want to begin with a few basic trends, and then I'll show you a number of other graphs about Turkey's absolute and relative performance over the last 2 centuries. I thought I should start with population. Turkey's population, as many of you know, is close to 80 million today, a little over 80 million. But many of us don't realize that Turkey's population 2 centuries ago was barely 10 million. It was not even 10 million within the present-day borders of Turkey. In fact, all the quantitative indices I will talk about today will refer to the present-day borders of Turkey, of the area within present-day borders of Turkey. So the population increased from about 9.5 million to more than 80 million today. But that certainly, for the people in this country, that's a very rapid growth of population. But it turns out that Turkey's population over the last 2 centuries increased at the same pace as the world population. So Turkey's share in world population remained remarkably constant, fluctuated within a narrow range around 1% of world population. And so Turkey's share in world GDP also fluctuated around 1% of world GDP. This is a graph about share of exports, share of exports and imports of the area within present-day borders of Turkey as a percent of GDP. Economists use this as an indicator of the degree of openness of an economy. And you can see the basic trends over the last 2 centuries. And these trends are closely related to the economic policies followed in each of the periods. In the 19th century, you see the rise, this rise in these ratios, share of exports and imports in GDP are rising. Well, that was, 19th century was the century of globalization, rising trade, Okay? So Turkey's economy was opening up to trade and international investment. And then from the end of World War I, but especially after 1929, along with many other developing countries, Turkey's economy turned inward. So you have the interwar period where these indices began to decline. This is the period of deglobalization, what many people refer to as deglobalization. And Turkey attempted to industrialize for the domestic market, what most people call import substituting industrialization. And it was led in the 1930s by the state sector. And then after World War II, Turkey embraced a multi-party democracy, but economic policies continued to emphasize domestic market-oriented industrialization, but this time they were led by the private sector. You can see in the third period from the end of the World War II to the 1980, these indices began to decline. Import substituting industrialization continued, share of exports and imports in GDP continued to decline. And then finally, the last period since 1980, policies changed once again, as in many other developing countries. Trade liberalization, emphasis on exports, customs union with the European Union signed in 1994, all of those led to moderately rapid rise in exports over GDP and imports. So Turkey's economy turned outward again, once again, after 1980. So these four periods are roughly in parallel with what most other developing countries did during these 2 centuries. In terms of basic trends, I think it's important to mention Turkey's patterns of urbanization. Rates of urbanization in Turkey remained close to, below, and then a little above 20% in the 19th century and up to 1950. Okay? This matters for economic growth because I want to emphasize ultimately economic growth, increases in incomes are related to the diffusion of new technology. And if people lived in the rural areas as they did until 1950, the diffusion of new technology and above all industrialization was slow. There was a spurt in the 1930s, but ultimately for Turkey's economic growth to pick up, it had to come along with industrialization and urbanization. So you can see in this graph how share of urban population began to pick up after 1950, along with it, share of population in industry and urban services. And here, I wanted to show the long-term trend for higher incomes, GDP per capita in Turkey over the course of 2 centuries. For the 20th century, these numbers are ultimately from official series, but for the 19th century, these are based on my own estimates for some benchmark years, and these GDP per capita are in purchasing power parity adjusted terms. But basically, this graph shows how per capita incomes increased over time. Please note that the vertical axis is in log scale, so about 2 centuries ago, per capita incomes in 1990 US dollars were about $700 US dollars, 1990 US dollars, and today they are about 10,000, 1990 dollars roughly. So what this graph suggests that per capita incomes in Turkey have increased 14, 15 times over 2 centuries. If people consume the same basket of things, bread and cheese, that means for the average person there would be 14, 15 times more bread and cheese to consume. But certainly the basket of goods have changed. There is train travel, airplanes, computers, things that did not exist 2 centuries ago. So there are some issues of measurement here. Ultimately, economists have to deal with this. But broadly speaking, they show that incomes have increased, so 14, 15 times. And also note that the slope of this line gives the rate of increase or the rate of growth, and the slope of this line was lower until after World War II. So rate of increase in per capita incomes was below 1% per year until after World War II, with the exception of a spurt in the 1930s. And that rate of increase picked up considerably to about 2.5–3% per year since the end of World War II. Well, what does it mean? What it means is that it took roughly 70 years for incomes to double. Until 1950, it took roughly 70 years for incomes to double, but since 1950, it takes only about a generation, only about 22 years or so for incomes to double. So incomes have been rising at a faster pace. In this graph, I express everything in terms of GDP per capita of Western Europe and the United States. Okay, so in this graph, I'm measuring Turkey, other developing countries, as percentages for each of the benchmark years, as percentages of income in Western Europe and the United States. What this graph shows is that in the 19th century, Turkey's incomes, shown with the broken red lines, declined as a percentage of Western Europe and the United States, meaning the gap between Turkey and Western Europe increased during the 19th century, in fact, until 1950. And then since 1950, Turkey's incomes as a percentage of Western Europe and the United States have been rising a little. So there has been some catch-up since 1950. There was divergence, certainly in the 19th century, and with the exception of the 1930s, up to 1950, there was divergence, and then there is some mild catch-up. But what's also remarkable about this is the stability of this pattern. These things did not easily change over the last 2 centuries. I have another similar graph here. I thought I would also compare Turkey with 2 southern European countries and 2 countries in the Middle East of similar size, large, medium-sized, large countries. And when I first drew this graph, what I was struck with was how stable this pattern and the rankings of these 5 countries were over the last 2 centuries. Italy and Spain remained with incomes above those of Turkey the entire period, and then Turkey's incomes per capita incomes remained above those of Iran and Egypt for most of the period. Okay? Remarkable how little change there has been in this ranking over the course of the 2 centuries. Turkey experienced divergence and a little bit of catch-up since 1950. Iran and Egypt did not. Italy and Spain experienced stronger catch-up since 1950. Now, economic historians, economists, in recent decades have recognized that GDP per capita is not the only measure of long-term economic development, that we need to look at things like, well, what economists call human development. We need to look at health, longevity, and education. So briefly, I want to show you some trends, absolute, relative trends on life expectancy in Turkey. Life expectancy within the present-day borders of Turkey was less than 30 years. It was more like 27, 28 years 2 centuries ago. That's because infant mortality was so high. Infant mortality was more like 40%. Okay? So that was also the case for most developing countries for most of the 19th century. And of course, so you see here that life expectancy in Turkey has increased more or less at the same pace as that of the world as a whole. Turkey's life expectancy remained below that of the world averages until recently, but in recent decades, in the recent 3 decades, Turkey's life expectancy exceeded that of the world. And it's now 76 years for average, 78 for women, and 74 for men. So, again, average, close to average. Okay? But I want to also look at education. We don't have many detailed indices for education, but we have one thing that we can calculate for all countries in the world going back to 19th century, and that's the average years of schooling for the adult population. You can see here that average years of schooling for adult population in Turkey remained below 1 year until after 1950. And Turkey's education, years of schooling in Turkey remained well below those of world averages. Well, for the entire period, they still remain below those of world averages. These are important for understanding Turkey's economic performance, and I'll come to that. But Turkey's healthcare longevity is now slightly above world averages, but its education levels, schooling years, is still below world averages. So, I want to now give you some proximate causes for why the economic growth in Turkey has been close to world averages, but not higher. I could have asked a different question. I could have said why there was economic growth at all. I'll try to answer that, but I'll try to also answer the question why economic growth has not been any higher. Ultimately, it comes down to the pace of diffusion of the new technologies. In the 19th century, and until the 1950s, as I've already mentioned, relatively low rates of urbanization meant that the new technologies spread rather slowly until industrialization started. Okay. And you can see here in this graph, until the 1950s, share of agriculture in the economy was high and share of manufacturing remained low. Share of manufacturing remained below, until 1950 remained well below 20%. Share of agriculture was 40 to 50%. So these trends give us some sense of how a mostly agricultural, mostly rural country experienced some modest rates of economic growth and increases in income until 1950. And you can see that in this graph as well. This graph shows what the fraction of income that was set aside for investment. In the 19th century, rates of savings and investment were very low. At the very beginning, in fact, they were barely enough to make up for the wear and tear on existing capital. But over time, share of savings and investment began to rise. By early 20th century, they were about 7-8% of GDP. And then shares of savings and investment rose after World War II. So more of the income was being set aside for investment in new equipment, and a part of this was also in construction until recently. And I'll come back to this graph in a second. Okay. But again, the incomes are rising. These graphs show incomes were rising. But I want to remind you that levels of education were lagging behind world averages. So already in the 19th century, in the 20th century, levels of education placed constraint on the kind of economy Turkey had and developed. Skill levels, education levels were low, and the ability to adopt technology remained limited. And then I want to point to another pattern in recent decades about the savings rate and the investment rate. The broken line here refers to the savings rate. Just as a point of comparison, rates of savings and investment in China today are in the range of 40 to 50%. So the Chinese are setting aside a very high share of their income and investing that. Very complex, lots of reasons, but that's how and why the Chinese economy is able to grow at a high rate. In the case of Turkey, savings rate stopped growing in the 1980s and in the 1990s, around 20%. Not only that, but they have declined in the last 2 decades. Turks like to consume now, not defer it for future, but we like consuming now. Not only that, but there is in the economy demand for new investment. Businesses want to invest, but these Turkish economy does only by borrowing from abroad. The gap between those 2 lines refers to the amount that Turkish economy is forced to borrow every year from abroad, mostly from European banks, more recently also from Middle Eastern bank, but mostly from European banks. That means over the last 2-3 decades, not only rates of savings have remained low, rates of investment have remained close to averages, but Turkey has been forced to borrow from abroad to keep even this average rate of investment. And of course, every time the lenders perceived that things were not going right, they stopped lending. So over the last 20, 30 years, Turkey has been experiencing these stop, go cycles. Every time lending slows down, as it is now, the economy grinds to a halt. And also, part of this average, close to average rates of investment, one related result was the slow rise in share of manufacturing, and more recently the decline in the share of manufacturing. This red line at the bottom, you can see share of manufacturing increased to up to about 25% of GDP, but has been declining since. I would like to argue that manufacturing is very important for the capacity of an economy to embrace new technologies, increase productivity, but share of manufacturing in Turkey has not been rising in recent decades. It turns out that Turkey is not unique in this regard. Many other developing countries have been experiencing this trend in recent decades. Just to remind you, one reason may be that big China, East Asian countries have been doing most of the manufacturing, and the rest of the developing world is having a much difficult time. But whatever the causes, but also there is the fact that investment rates have been in Turkey have been low, and then if you subtract from these investment rates investment in construction and focus on physical capital, new technologies, these rates are even lower. In fact, most recent rates of investment in Turkey in new plant and equipment are more in the range of about 10, 12%, so very low. And that helps explain why income increases have not been any faster. Helps explain why rates of growth have been close to global averages, well, developing country averages in Turkey, but not any higher. So I should also mention a couple of other things, not only education, but women's labor force participation in Turkey is very low. In urban areas today, only about 32% of women participate in the labor force, meaning work outside the home. Okay? So, of course, that's not only because women want to stay home, it's also because new jobs are not being opened for women. But these also help explain why rates of economic growth, rates of increase in per capita income have not been any higher. So I tried to provide some proximate causes for why economic growth has not been any faster. So then I want to finally, in the remaining few slides, I want to talk about why this has been the pattern. I want to talk about the deeper causes for this pattern. Why economic growth has been close to averages. Well, I hope you'll agree with me that to offer a single cause for a story that spans 2 centuries would be overly simplistic. Okay, and it would be awful for me to give you a single cause. So I'll try to talk about a number of things, both global and also domestic. And I'll offer what I see to be the most important causes for this pattern. I'll talk about global causes, and domestically I'll talk about politics. I'll talk about the persistent tensions and cleavages in Turkey and their consequences on long-term economic development. About the big global causes. Well, let's look at it this way. Turkey was not an early industrializer, was not even a late industrializer, as like other countries in Europe or in Japan. Turkey was a late industrializer. Industrialization in Turkey really began sometime in the 20th century. There was some industrialization in the 19th century, but industrialization began really in the 1930s. So Turkey had the advantage that new technologies were being developed elsewhere, and Turkey could adopt those technologies, import those technologies. But at the same time, those early industrializers were often the more powerful countries in more or less all periods, at least in most of the periods. Those early industrializers were the countries that also set the global rules. And those global rules had important implications for the late industrializers. Now, Turkey didn't have colonial rule, but in each of these periods, Turkey had to follow the global institutions and rules set up by the early industrializers, perhaps with the exception of the interwar period. In the 19th century, it was free trade. One way or another, Turkey, Ottoman government agreed to free trade, which meant that in the 19th century, the Ottoman economy remained open. There was very little industrialization until after World War I. Those global rules were a bit more relaxed after World War II, what is called the Bretton Woods rules. Bretton Woods rules after World War II allowed for more autonomy for individual countries. Okay? But since 1980, these global rules are, once again, more strict. What late industrializers can do, cannot do, depends on those rules. So Turkey needs to remain engaged with the global economy. Turkey needs to be part of the global economy. But if you look at the 200-year history, Turkey, in some of these periods, Turkey could have done a better job, given all the constraints, could have done a better job in its relations with the global economy. The Ottoman Empire, the Ottoman government did not have the power really to set its own tariffs, commercial policy, and could not perhaps escape the free trade rules. But in the Bretton Woods era, 60s, 70s, for example, Turkey remained inward for too long. Perhaps governments in Turkey could have moved towards exports a little earlier. By the same token, in the last period, since 1980, Turkey once again embraced the rules of globalization wholesale. Trade liberalization, okay, that's fine. But Turkey also embraced financial globalization wholesale. Turkey could have been more selective. Some of you, I'm sure, will say, easier said than done. But Turkey embraced financial globalization, opened the economy to all capital flows in 1989, and they've made things much more difficult. So that's the global part. Those are the rules and constraints associated with the workings of the global economy. Now I want to say a few words, finally, about the domestic reasons why Turkey's long-term economic performance has not been significantly higher than developing country averages. If you look at the last 2 centuries, since the 1820s, 1830s, Turkey did not experience any colonial rule, but Turkey's own elites have launched waves and waves of institutional changes, reforms, beginning with the Tanzimat of the 19th century, continuing with the Turkish Republic in the 1920s, 1930s, and then continuing with the multi-party democracy. Well, these were uneven, but on the whole, these attempts at modernization, whole series of changes in law, education, fiscal system, administration, and so on, these have helped economic growth. But they were not the only story. These institutional changes were part of the story, only part of the story. If I were to point out to some domestic causes for why Turkey's economic growth has not been any higher, I would say that politics is where the answer is. A stable, inclusive political system, most political economists would agree, is important for long-term economic development. However, since the 19th century, Turkey has been experiencing a series of tensions and cleavages. In the 19th century, along with reforms and opening to globalization, tensions emerged between the more secular elites of the center and the more conservative elites in the provinces, Muslim elites in the provinces, but also between the non-Muslims who were perceived to be the beneficiaries of globalization and the Muslims. These tensions and cleavages continued in the 20th century, in the early republic, and also in the multi-party era. And Turkey's multi-party democracy and political institutions were not able to handle these tensions and cleavages very well. Turkey experienced a series of military coups since 1960, okay? And the tensions between the reformist secular elites and the conservative elites in the periphery and now at the center continued. And also cleavages, tensions between the Turks and the Kurds continued. Now, we are all aware of the macroeconomic, short and medium-term macroeconomic consequences of these tensions. These tensions lead to periods of macroeconomic instability, inflation, okay? But there have been also some longer-term consequences. I would argue that in the longer term, these tensions between elites have adversely affected state capacity. State capacity, state interventionism is key for late industrializing countries. When you are late industrializing, what the state does, how the state tries to compensate for being late is very important. But because of these tensions and because of the political instabilities and the divisions, state interventionism in Turkey has not been effective. Those of you who follow Turkey would know that in recent decades, but also in earlier periods, state interventionism, state support meant that the governments supported those closest to them, rather than supporting those most productive enterprises or individuals. So in Turkey, it has been difficult for impersonal rules to emerge and to be established. Rather, government support has often been directed to those closest to the party in power, rather than to individuals and enterprises that are most productive. Well, when this kind of state interventionism combined with relatively low levels of education, okay, Turkey's experience with new technologies has not been very strong. Turkey's, if you look at production, technology content of production and exports, they have been low in Turkey. And today, Turkey exports a good deal, but Turkey's exports are in often goods with standard technologies and not in high technology goods. So rates of investment have been close to averages. Productivity and GDP per capita growth have remained close to, a little above averages. And I would argue that the big, deeper answer lies with the global rules and also with the domestic politics. In conclusion, I would say that not only for its own sake, but also for stronger economic development, in Turkey, different groups learn to live with their differences and with the diversity that conflict resolution and the institutions of conflict resolution are very important, not only for politics, but also for economic development. And finally, I would think that this final point is important not only for Turkey, but for many other developing countries as well. Thank you very much.
So, Professor Pamuk will be happy, I'm sure, to take questions. I believe we have microphones for the questioners. Yes. So just raise your hand and we'll bring you a mic. Just a second until the mic. Can you come here, please? This gentleman in the second row with the blue shirt. Sorry, here you go.
I am Murat Yülek. I am a visiting scholar at SIPA here. Thank you very much for this wonderful presentation. I just want to ask two things because I didn't see the book, but I got the presentation. I wanted to see what you think of those other factors that probably differentiated Turkey from the other crowd, let's say. One is you mentioned the state capacity, which is, I think, very important factor. I actually studied it comparing Turkey with South Korea. In terms of policy and outcomes, industrial policy and outcomes. So if a state is a good state, it's supposed to do better policies and implement better policies. So I was trying to understand whether Korea and Turkey, there was a difference between Korea and Turkey in that respect. So that is one. The second is somewhat related. Let's say 1A, 1B now, okay? Mm-hmm. So what Turkey did generally in terms of policy, development policy, is they translated what they got from abroad, mostly. Mm-hmm. For example, between 1960s and 1980s, as we all know, Turkey used import substitution policies. So did Latin American countries, so did a lot of other countries. But Korea was a big difference, and that was a homegrown idea. They used import substitution plus export promotion at the same time. What Turkey did was, and that's in my paper actually, we used 1960 and 80, the import substitution alone, and then export promotion alone, and that didn't work very well when you compare to the outcomes to Korea. So do you have anything to say about this, because you told about trade and everything? The last thing is, that's two now. We spoke about state capacity, and one other differentiating factor, I think, is the capacity of the private sector. If you have good companies, that helps development. If you have good entrepreneurs, private, that helps the development. If you don't have them, whether large companies or small, that will be detrimental to your development. What do you think of this? Thank you.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Thank you for these points, okay? I agree with you that Korea presents a case of a much more effective state interventionism. It's in fact often seen as a textbook case of how state interventionism should be. Okay? By the same token, Turkey's state interventionism has not been that effective. The only thing, and I agree with you that Korea was able to move on to export growth at an earlier stage, where Turkey, again, because also of political difficulties, was not able to move to exports until after 1980. The only thing I would say is that, add to your point, is that even though Korea has been effective, Korean recipe does not necessarily travel well to Turkey. That, at the end of the day, I think this is a message that's coming out of those who study economic development, that you can't really have a single recipe for all, that Turkey has to, in the end, look at other countries' experiences, but find a solution about state, economy, and so on that fits better its social structure, historical circumstances. okay? And these would have to take into account these tensions and cleavages I mentioned. And the point you made about private sector, again, I agree with you. Private sector has not been strong. Well, that I would argue that's in part because of those tensions and cleavages, because the private sector has been divided as well. In fact, in Turkey, the big social actors, not only the private sector is divided, we all know today it's divided between the conservatives and the seculars, the workers are also divided. We have the secular labor unions today, leftist labor unions, but we also have the Islamist labor unions, far-right labor unions. So these big actors that are responsible in the narrative for many other developing other countries are very divided in Turkey, and that also helps explain why economic development has been difficult.
Thank you. Another question in the back on the left. Yes, yes. Aisha, wait for the microphone.
Hi, thank you, Professor Pamuk, for your talk. I'm a first-year history student, PhD student in the history department here. My name is Yasemin. My question is about sort of your process. You said that you collected the data for particularly the Ottoman portion of the talk. I'm wondering, what is the process like when you turn historical information that isn't, produced for the sake of economic analysis into something that's we would consider today economic data? So what kinds of sources do you consult? Where do you find these sources? But also, how do you render them into sort of what we today consider economic data?
Thank you, Yasmin.
Okay, this is a question from Department of History. I can recognize.
She's our student.
Yes. Well, look, let me just say, I understand you, and all my life I've had this tension between historians and economists. Historians say, hey, there are problems with this data, and rather than making any mistakes, I'd rather not touch any data. And economists say, give me data, I'll put it in my regressions. And they don't even bother to, economists often don't bother when they have this kind of data, obviously to ask historians, what's wrong with this data? But I'm trying to be somewhere in the middle, okay? I am aware that these data have problems, okay? But I try to do, just to be simplistic, I try to do the best I can with estimates for GDP per capita. I look, data is limited, but then I look at countries and I learn from other countries with similar structures and so on. Perhaps of all the things I offered you today, the most outlandish would be my life expectancy at birth estimates for early 19th century. There is zero data for Turkey for life expectancy at birth in 1820. Zero data, okay? But there are estimates for Italy. There are estimates for Russia. There are some estimates for India. And they are all below 30 years, okay? For Turkey, there are some estimates for the year 1910, okay? So I can go back, and I can go back gently, and I make some assumptions. So I reached this estimate of 27, 28. If I were a strict historian, I would say we don't know. But I prefer to say 27, 28 until someone else comes and corrects me. But I suspect that that's not going to be very soon.
In the back, over there, please.
Thank you. I'm going to refer to several of your slides. So you have the slide for the centralization as far as urbanization. You also have the slide which shows around the 1950s moving into urban centers.
Yeah.
Then also, correct me if I'm wrong on any of these as I go over them. Then you also have the decline in agriculture in about the 1950s, going and being more into manufacturing in the service sector,
Yeah.
more manufacturing.
Yes, yes.
But you also have the slide that shows an increase in GDP starting in the 1940s into the mid-1950s. And so I'm wondering, what was the cause of that increase in GDP if it was not coming from manufacturing? So this increase in GDP actually predates the decline in agriculture and also the increase to urbanization.
Okay. I'd better answer this question specifically, otherwise. This one, yeah? Oh. Okay. Well, let me say this. Yeah, microphone. There is an increase in GDP after 1945 because of simple economic recovery of the impact of the war. Even though Turkey did not participate in World War II, because all external trade was cut off and a variety of other things, and the maintenance of a large army, GDP declined by as much as 30–40% up to 1945. So even before people began to move to urban areas, even there was economic recovery just from World War II. And incidentally, countries like Italy, France, Greece, all who were actively involved in the war also experienced recovery in the second half of the 1940s. So this was a simple economic recovery based mostly on agricultural production, agriculture returning back to its earlier levels, but for industrialization and so on, that came much later. Does that?
The recovery was above the pre-war levels. So I'm kind of also, I'll refer to another one, is that your exports seem to have increased at that same time. So the recovery seemed to be higher than the pre-war levels. So was Turkey really exporting a lot of agricultural products at that time? And would that be an explanation?
Yeah, I think Turkey was exporting agricultural products in the first half of the 1950s. Remember Korean War and so on. So that helped the boom. But just and add a point, Turkey experienced a lot of industrialization in the 1930s with this state-led industrialization. So the peak in per capita income for the first half of the 20th century is the year 1939. Just before war, per capita incomes reached their peak for the first half of the 20th century. And then per capita incomes exceeded the 1939 levels in the year 1952 and so, first with agriculture and then in the 60s with rapid industrialization. In the 60s, 70s, industrialization rates exceeded 8% per annum. So big domestic market protected by tariffs. So there was a lot of growth there in the 60s, 70s.
Here in the front, please. He's coming.
Thank you for the wonderful lecture. I would like to ask, what outcomes do you predict for the future of Turkey, thinking about the technology, the coming technology, and the potential unemployment, and the potential, not potential, actually the situational trade wars globally.
Okay. Now, I can't answer this question as a historian, okay, I think. So I have to try to answer this question more as an economist. But my basing point would be that the main factors I argued about tensions and politics are really key to the future of Turkey's economy. How Turkey handles the politics will determine the future of economic development in Turkey. Rule, I think, right now, I would say rule of law is the single most important thing for the future of Turkey's economy. You can't have economic development. You can only have what some people call low quality growth when you don't have rule of law. Private sector will not invest, or at least not at the earlier levels if you don't have rule of law. If private sector, if companies feel that they cannot go to court to seek their interests, they will simply not invest. And I think that's what's been happening in Turkey in the last decade. So for the future, rule of law, more inclusive political institutions, this is where we start. But there is also, I would say that Turkey has to do a better job with education, technology, right, to move up to higher levels of growth and so on. But I began with the most urgent points.
Aisha, again in the front row, please.
I have a question relating the economy and politics. Even as scholars in political science, we analyze the 1980s, for instance, in Turkey, when the change towards export promotion started. We always think that in also other countries as well, the first question alluded to that, that the regime changes that followed, in fact, has a lot to do with that switch to export promotion, So in a way, economy having an impact on the political regime changes in several countries, including Turkey, because I think January 24 decisions were the first decisions, 1980, towards, opening up, and then during the same year, there was a military coup d'etat. But, with this analysis at the back of my mind, when I listen to you, I'm really actually happily surprised to see that as a professor of economic history, you at the end of the day say it's politics that determines the economy, like perhaps somewhat in the tradition of Polanyi, really, I think, who also alludes to the significance. So at what point in your work that you reached this, because you basically ended by referring to conflict resolution as the solution. So it's not in the economy, but it's in politics.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I am not alone. I mean, if you look at economists, those who are dealing with issues of long-term economic development over the last 30 years, they've also changed their views. I think when we go back to the 1960s, okay, and to models of economic growth, most economists thought that growth would arrive at the same pace to all developing countries, and they would all follow the same path, okay? But now, it's been half a century since the 1960s, of the optimism of the 1960s, and there is still a lot of unevenness and variation in the experiences of developing countries. So the economists also are looking for answers in the interaction between the external and the domestic. Okay? I don't want to throw out the external. I don't want to throw out the role of the global and how you deal with the global, how societies, different societies deal with the global, because many economists are inclined to look at only the domestic, only the some cultural. But I would say that politics is very, very important. And when I look at the experiences, Turkey's experiences in different turning points, as it was also alluded earlier, it was often the politics that led to a delayed response or no response in Turkey to the pressing economic problems. So, and again, then and also the role of the state. That's also very important. So I agree with you.
Wait for the microphone so
Yeah.
we can hear, please. Can we have the microphone here, please?
Yeah.
The actual situation and political situation and economical situation had to do a lot with secularism and religious and confusion in between.
I think it is not secular versus Islamic, but our ability to deal with tensions and differences. It is the differences and how we deal with differences rather than secular versus Islamic per se. Okay, which I think is different, because when you look at different periods in the last 2 centuries, it's not the secular versus Islamic. Yes, but what is common is our difficulties in dealing with diversity and differences rather than the specific difference we may be experiencing at a given time. Okay? So that's why I mentioned at the very end of my talk conflict resolution, or the institutions of conflict resolution, how we deal with those conflicts or how we deal with those differences is more important than the specific difference.
Over there, please, and then.
Enjoyed your talk. Thanks very much. And you made a remark regarding Turkey's negotiations with the West and the global order. I mean, economically. And you said Turkey didn't do a good job. You made that remark. Could you elaborate on that?
Yeah. Well, there is one point I made, that these global rules put constraints, and that most developing countries are not large enough or powerful enough to change the rules. The big exception is China. China is big enough, right, that it has been able to bend the rules. But most other countries take the rules as given or close to given and then try to place themselves somewhere given those rules and deal with those rules. It is in this second respect that I felt that governments in Turkey have not done a very good job. Okay. Now, one example I gave about the 1960s, 1970s. The global rules in the 1960s, 1970s, more generally after World War II, allowed countries to prioritize domestic economy, industrialization, erect tariffs, and so on. So Turkey did. But then the countries that were more successful grew out of them and then began to promote exports and found their way. Well, when it was a time in the case of Turkey to make that shift, end of 60s, early 70s, that response did not come in Turkey. Turkey was too busy with its domestic politics then. Then let's take another period, the last period, since 1980. I said that the global rules are more strict. Washington Consensus, you have to do this, okay? And there is much less room for domestic economy, a la Danny Roderick, for example, he would say. And domestic economy, and also there is less room for democracy. And there you find, for example, Turkey began with trade liberalization, and then in 1989 embraced financial globalization wholesale. Well, you know, Özal made this decision because I suspect, and many other people suspect, that he wanted to be able to borrow. Turkey's external debt was very low, and he wanted this transition to financial liberalization to enable him to borrow until those debt ratios rose, so he could enjoy it for a decade, which he did, which he could for some time. But that was a decision with long-term negative consequences. Turkey began to experience a lot of instability with the stop-and-go cycles and so on. So that was another example of how the choices made vis-a-vis the global rules put Turkey at a disadvantage or hurt growth in the longer term. I mean, those consequences, those constraints exist today. I think, let's say, Turkey could have had designed a more intelligent way with respect to the capital account. Yeah?
Ma'am, over here again, please.
Thank you for an enlightening presentation. My question is, do you have a key strategy for developing countries such as Turkey who have a relatively high consumer base and low manufacturing base, for those countries to become competitive in the global scene? Would you say that turning inward for a short period of time, I don't mean for a short period of time, in the short run, enough for them to increase their national income and also establish a strong or stronger internal financial system, institutions? Would that be more beneficial for those countries instead of opening up and trying to engage more and more into the global scene?
Well, let me say, just to be consistent with what I've been saying today, no government will listen to me. Turkey has to develop something out of its own politics at the end of the day. And I should also say that it's not easy right now for countries to turn inward. World Trade Organization has rules, and you have to be big as China to say, well, we can have our own rules. So it is not easy under current rules to turn inward, to do this, to do that, okay? And not only that, but you have to have your domestic politics right, okay? If you have an understanding or practice of state interventionism which favors companies and individuals close to you, then as long as that approach exists, I think no policy can be effective in the medium and long term. That out of Turkey's current politics, there has to emerge a new understanding of what state stands for, how industrialization can proceed, and so on. Until then, I feel that those recipes can come and go, but they will not be successful in the medium and long term. But I could say this, that there is one thing in the long term that's important. Turkey's education record has not been strong. We have elite education, top schools, top universities are producing very good graduates. Many of our graduates of the top schools come to universities like Columbia, top universities. They do PhDs in this country. But many of them also stay here. So our education system has not been strong in developing skills across the spectrum. And so, and that combined with the type of state interventionism we have means that we have not been successful in moving up to higher technologies. We're very good in construction. Okay? Construction is low tech, and it also makes it easy for governments to make their friends rich in a short time. Well, with that kind of politics, it's very difficult to have long-term economic development. We have had average. And my point today is that I am not satisfied with average. If we want to do better than average, or significantly better than average, what kinds of things need to change? So that's my point today.
I think this will have to be the last question.
Okay.
But please wait for the microphone.
Going on within the government supporting, and maybe not enough internal economical regulations put in, etc., etc. Do you think more and more Turkish industrialists move abroad and try to do investments abroad?
What do you think?
I think yes.
I'm afraid so. And in fact, I don't have to say it, it's already happening. In fact, look at it this way. I think in the last 20, 30 years in Turkey, as one of my graphs showed, you need to be a hero to stay with manufacturing. Because there are so many other opportunities outside of manufacturing. Manufacturing, especially manufacturing for export markets, is very difficult under the present circumstances in Turkey. Okay? So all those who invest, they invest in other areas, they invest in services, construction, and so on. So those who persist in industry, manufacturing, I think they deserve, all of them, they deserve medals.
Yes. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have. I'm going to invite you to do two things. First of all, I want to invite you to a reception, which will be held outside immediately afterwards. And secondly, I want to invite you to join me in thanking Professor Pamuk for his wonderful work.
So, thank you very much, everyone. I enjoyed it, and I want to thank the university and the center for the invitation too.
I want to thank the center as well.